Hungry boy asked a millionaire for a snack, but the millionaire's reaction shocked everyone, because what started as a simple request for food turned into something that would expose secrets, and a truth so shocking that it changed everything forever. Thomas Bennett had exactly 12 minutes before his next board meeting, when a small hand tugged at his expensive suit jacket outside Henderson's Deli in downtown Chicago. He was 47 years old, ran 3 successful tech companies, and hadn't stopped moving in the last 18 hours. His phone buzzed with 17 unread messages, his coffee was getting cold, and the last thing he needed was another distraction. But when he looked down, he saw a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with dirt smudged across his freckled cheeks and shoes that were 2 sizes too big, held together with duct tape and hope. "Mister, I'm really hungry. Could you please buy me something to eat? Just a sandwich, anything," said the boy, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas froze. In his world of million-dollar deals and corporate acquisitions, he'd mastered the art of saying no to almost everything. No to unnecessary meetings, no to bad investments, no to people who wanted his time. But something about this kid's green eyes, the way he looked embarrassed to even be asking, made Thomas pause. The boy wasn't aggressive or demanding like some of the panhandlers Thomas usually brushed past. He was polite, almost apologetic, as if he knew he was interrupting something important. "What's your name, kid?" Thomas asked, surprising himself by actually engaging. "Jacob, sir. Jacob Miller," the boy replied, standing up a little straighter. Thomas noticed the boy's hands were trembling slightly. Not from cold, it was 72 degrees outside, but probably from hunger or nervousness or both. There was something about the way Jacob held himself, a dignity that didn't match his circumstances, that made Thomas uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. Here was this child, clearly in need, asking for help with more grace than most adults Thomas dealt with in his daily business life. "When's the last time you ate, Jacob?" Thomas found himself asking, already knowing he was going to miss his meeting. His assistant would be furious, the board members would be annoyed, but for the first time in years, Thomas didn't care about the consequences of being late. "Yesterday morning, sir. My mom, she's sick and we ran out of food stamps 3 days ago," Jacob said, looking down at his worn-out sneakers. Thomas felt something twist in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation he hadn't experienced in the 2 decades since he'd climbed his way out of poverty and into the penthouse offices where he now spent most of his waking hours. What Thomas didn't know in that moment, as he stood on that busy Chicago sidewalk with 17 unread messages and a cooling cup of coffee, was that saying yes to this hungry boy would completely unravel everything he thought he knew about success, family, and what actually mattered in life. But before we get to that part of the story, you need to understand just how far Thomas had fallen from the person he used to be, and how one simple act of kindness was about to expose secrets that would shake his entire world. Thomas led Jacob into Henderson's Deli, a place where he usually grabbed his morning coffee before heading to the office tower 3 blocks away. The owner, an older man named Stan Henderson, raised his eyebrows when he saw Thomas walk in with the disheveled kid, but didn't say anything. Thomas had been coming here for 6 years, always ordering the same thing, always in a hurry, always alone. This was different. "Order whatever you want, Jacob," Thomas said, gesturing toward the menu board above the counter. He watched as the boy's eyes scanned the prices, his lips moving slightly as he calculated, clearly trying to pick the cheapest item that would fill his stomach. "Just a plain sandwich would be fine, sir. Maybe turkey if that's okay," Jacob said carefully, as if he was afraid that asking for something specific might make the offer disappear. Thomas felt that uncomfortable twisting sensation in his chest again, the one he'd spent years learning to ignore. This kid was literally starving and still worried about being a burden, still trying to minimize his needs to make things easier for someone else. It reminded Thomas of something, a memory he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it never happened. "Stan, give us 2 of the lunch specials, the big ones, with the soup, the sandwich, the chips, and throw in a couple of those chocolate chip cookies," Thomas said, pulling out his wallet. "And pack 1 to go as well. Actually, make that 3 to go." Stan nodded and got to work, while Jacob stared at Thomas with an expression somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. "Sir, that's too much. I just needed something small," the boy protested weakly. "When's the last time your mom ate?" Thomas asked, already knowing the answer from the look on Jacob's face. They sat down at a corner booth, and Thomas watched as Jacob tried to eat slowly, tried to maintain some dignity, but the hunger won out. The boy devoured the sandwich in what felt like seconds, then started on the soup, and Thomas realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't just about one missed meal. This was about sustained, grinding poverty, the kind he remembered from his own childhood in the trailer park on the south side of Detroit. His phone kept buzzing. His assistant was definitely panicking by now. The board meeting had started without him, but Thomas couldn't bring himself to care. Something about this moment felt more important than any contract he'd ever signed. "Tell me about your mom, Jacob. What kind of sick is she?" Thomas asked, sipping his coffee while the boy ate. Jacob looked up, a flicker of worry crossing his young face. "She has something wrong with her lungs, sir. The doctor said she needs medicine, but it costs like $400 and our insurance doesn't cover it all. She can't work right now because she gets too tired and starts coughing real bad." Thomas knew that story too. He knew what it was like to watch a parent suffer because they couldn't afford basic medical care, to feel helpless as a kid while the adults in your life slowly fell apart. What he was about to discover, though, was that Jacob's situation was far more complicated than a simple case of poverty and illness, and the truth would force Thomas to confront the biggest mistake of his entire life. After Jacob finished eating, Thomas handed him the 3 takeout bags Stan had prepared. "This is for your mom and for later. Make sure she eats, okay?" Thomas said, standing up to leave. But something stopped him, a nagging feeling that just buying a few meals wasn't enough, that walking away now would be the easy thing, the comfortable thing, but not the right thing. "Where do you live, Jacob? How far is it from here?" Thomas asked, checking his watch out of habit even though he'd already mentally written off the entire afternoon. "It's about 20 blocks from here, sir, in the Riverside apartments, the ones by the old factory," Jacob said, clutching the bags like they were made of gold. Thomas knew those apartments. Everyone in Chicago knew those apartments. They were the kind of place where broken elevators stayed broken for months, where the heat worked maybe half the winter, where people got stuck because they had nowhere else to go. "That's too far to walk carrying all that food." "Come on, my car's in the garage across the street," Thomas said, making a decision that surprised even himself. Jacob hesitated, and Thomas could see the warning his mother had probably drilled into him about getting into cars with strangers warring with the practical reality that he was exhausted, hungry, and carrying food that needed to get home. "I promise I'm just giving you a ride home. Your mom's probably worried about you," Thomas said, and something in his tone must have been convincing because Jacob nodded. They walked to the parking garage in silence, and when they got to Thomas's black Mercedes, Jacob actually gasped. "Is this really your car, sir?" the boy asked, running his hand along the hood with reverence. "Yeah, it's just a car," Thomas said, but seeing it through Jacob's eyes, he suddenly saw it differently. This car cost more than most people made in 2 years. He'd bought it without thinking, the same way he bought his suits and his watches and his downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows. He'd stopped noticing the price tags on things sometime around his 3rd million, stopped thinking about what things cost because he could afford anything. But Jacob was looking at this car like it was a spaceship, and Thomas felt something uncomfortable stirring in his memory again. During the drive to Riverside, Jacob was quiet, staring out the window at the city passing by. Thomas tried to make conversation, asking about school, about friends, about what Jacob liked to do for fun. The answers were short and careful, the kind of answers a kid gives when he's not sure if he's in trouble or not. But when they pulled up in front of the Riverside apartments, a crumbling 6-story building with graffiti on the walls and trash in the courtyard, Jacob finally spoke up. "Sir, can I ask you something?" the boy said, his hand on the door handle. "Sure, kid, what is it?" Thomas replied. "Why are you being so nice to me? Most people just walk past like they don't even see me," Jacob said, and the question hung in the air between them like smoke. Thomas didn't have a good answer to that question, at least not one he was ready to say out loud. Why had he stopped? Why had he bought the food? Why was he sitting in front of these apartments instead of closing the Morrison deal that was probably falling apart without him? "I guess because someone was nice to me once, a long time ago, when I really needed it," Thomas finally said, which was true but not the whole truth. The whole truth was buried somewhere he didn't like to look, in memories of a trailer park and a single mom, and a version of himself that looked a lot like Jacob. "Well, thank you, sir. My mom's going to be so happy. She's been real worried about food," Jacob said, gathering the bags. "Hey, before you go, what apartment are you in?" Thomas asked, not really sure why he was asking. 3C, sir. Third floor. Jacob replied, already opening the door. Thomas watched the boy run toward the building, the bags bouncing against his legs, and something made him turn off the engine and follow. He told himself it was just to make sure the kid got inside safely, but deep down he knew it was something else, something pulling him forward that he didn't quite understand yet. The elevator was broken, of course, so Thomas climbed the stairs behind Jacob, noting the peeling paint, the flickering lights, the smell of mildew and desperation that clung to everything. By the time they reached the third floor, Jacob was breathing hard, probably still weak from hunger. The boy stopped in front of apartment 3C and knocked. "Mom, it's me. I got food," Jacob called out, his voice filled with excitement that broke Thomas's heart a little. The door opened and Thomas saw a woman who looked like she'd aged a decade in the last year. She was maybe 35, thin in the unhealthy way that comes from not eating, so your kids can, with dark circles under her eyes and a persistent cough that he could hear even from the hallway. But when she saw the food, her face lit up with relief. Then she saw Thomas standing behind Jacob, and her expression changed to confusion and wariness. "Jacob, who is this? What's going on?" she asked, pulling her son close protectively. "This is Mr. Bennett, Mom. He bought us food and drove me home. He's nice, I promise," Jacob said quickly. "Sarah Miller," the woman said, extending a thin hand. "Thomas Bennett," he replied, shaking it and noticing how cold her fingers were despite the summer heat. They stood there awkwardly for a moment until Thomas did something completely out of character. "Can I come in for a minute? I'd like to talk to you about something," he said, not even sure himself what he wanted to talk about. Sarah hesitated, looking from Thomas in his $2,000 suit to her apartment that probably wasn't fit for visitors, but finally nodded and stepped aside. "Before I tell you what Thomas discovered inside that apartment, before I reveal the truth that was about to change everything, let me ask you something. What would you do in Thomas's position? Would you have stopped for that hungry kid? Or would you have walked past like everyone else? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're enjoying this story so far, hit that like button, because what happens next is absolutely incredible. The apartment was small, maybe 600 square feet total, with furniture that looked like it had been rescued from curbs and walls that desperately needed paint. But it was clean, obsessively so. The kind of clean that comes from pride being the only thing you have left. Thomas could see where Sarah had tried to make it a home with dollar store picture frames and secondhand decorations. Could see the effort she'd put into creating something stable for her son in the middle of chaos. There was a younger child too, a girl about 5 years old coloring at a card table in the corner. "That's my sister Emma," Jacob said, setting the food bags on the tiny kitchen counter. "She's 5, and she's in kindergarten." Emma looked up at Thomas with huge brown eyes, taking in his expensive watch and shiny shoes with the unfiltered curiosity of a child. "Are you rich?" she asked bluntly, and Sarah immediately rushed to correct her. "Emma, that's not polite." But Thomas just laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd had in months. "Yeah, I guess I am pretty rich," he admitted. Sarah opened the takeout bags and her eyes filled with tears when she saw how much food there was. "This is too much, Mr. Bennett. We can't accept all this," she said, even though Thomas could see her hands trembling as she looked at the sandwiches and soup. "It's already bought and paid for. Please, just eat it," Thomas said, and watched as Sarah finally gave in, calling Emma over to the table. The two kids tore into the food with the same desperate hunger Jacob had shown at the deli, and Sarah ate more slowly, probably trying to make it last, probably already planning how to stretch this food into tomorrow's meals too. "Jacob said you've been sick. How long has this been going on?" Thomas asked, sitting down on the worn couch that probably came from the Salvation Army. Sarah looked embarrassed but answered honestly. "About 4 months now. Started as a bad cold that just never went away, turned into something worse. The free clinic said it's a lung infection and I need antibiotics and an inhaler, but even with the discount program, it's still money I don't have." She coughed as if to emphasize the point, a deep, rattling cough that made Emma look up with worry in her young eyes. Thomas found himself asking questions he never asked, learning details about Sarah's life that made his own problem seem ridiculous. She'd been a waitress at a diner until she got too sick to work. Jacob's father had left before Emma was born. No child support, no contact, nothing. Sarah's own parents were dead, no siblings, no family to help. They'd been living on food stamps and her saved tips for months. But the savings were gone now and the food stamps didn't stretch far enough. She was 3 months behind on rent and the eviction notice was sitting on the counter, hidden under a stack of bills she couldn't pay. "How much do you owe?" Thomas heard himself ask, knowing he was crossing some invisible line from stranger to involved, from detached observer to participant in this family's struggle. Sarah looked uncomfortable, probably sensing that same line being crossed. "Mr. Bennett, you've already done so much. We'll figure it out somehow," she said. But Thomas could hear the defeat in her voice, the knowledge that there was no figuring it out, that they were circling the drain, and it was only a matter of time. "How much, Sarah?" Thomas insisted gently. She sighed, got up, and brought him the eviction notice. $3,200 in back rent, plus late fees. Due in 14 days, or they'd be out on the street. Thomas looked at the number and almost laughed. $3,200. He'd spent more than that on dinner last month, celebrating a merger that he honestly couldn't even remember the details of now. He'd spent that much on a watch he wore twice and left in a drawer. This amount of money, which meant absolutely nothing to him, was the difference between these kids having a roof over their heads or sleeping in a shelter. "What if I paid this?" Thomas said, pulling out his phone. "What?" Sarah's voice was sharp with disbelief. "No, absolutely not. I don't even know you. We're not charity cases." Thomas could see the pride flashing in her eyes, the same pride that probably kept her from asking for help even when she desperately needed it. "It's not charity. Think of it as an investment," Thomas said, not even sure what he meant by that. "An investment in what exactly?" Sarah asked, crossing her arms defensively. Thomas didn't have an answer ready. An investment in what? In feeling less guilty about his wealth? In assuaging the memory of his own childhood poverty? In proving to himself that he wasn't completely disconnected from his humanity? In making sure these kids have a place to sleep tonight and tomorrow night and the night after that? He finally said, which was true enough even if it wasn't the whole truth. Sarah studied him for a long moment and Thomas could see her weighing her options, her pride against her children's welfare, her independence against their immediate survival. "If I let you do this, and that's a big if, I need you to understand something, Mr. Bennett," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the cough that punctuated her sentences. "I will pay you back, every single dollar. It might take me years, but I will pay you back. I'm not looking for a handout." Thomas nodded, respecting her even as he knew he'd never accept repayment. "Deal. Now let me make a call." He stepped into the hallway and within 5 minutes had transferred the money directly to the landlord, with instructions to clear Sarah Miller's account and extend her lease. It was that easy for him. A few taps on his phone and a family's immediate crisis was solved. So why did he feel like he'd just started something much bigger than paying rent? What do you think Sarah should do? Should she accept help from a wealthy stranger? Or is her pride justified? Tell me in the comments what you would do in her situation. And real quick, if you think Thomas is doing the right thing here, leave your like on this video. Thomas came back into the apartment and told Sarah it was done, the rent was paid, the eviction was canceled. She stood there for a moment looking stunned. Then without warning she burst into tears, real gasping sobs that she tried to muffle with her hand. Jacob and Emma both ran to her, confused and scared by their mother's crying. "It's okay, babies. These are happy tears. Mr. Bennett helped us. We get to stay in our home," Sarah managed to say between sobs, and Thomas had to look away because something was happening in his chest again, that uncomfortable twisting that he couldn't control. He stayed for another hour, learning more about their lives. Jacob was 8 years old, smart as a whip according to his teachers, loved science and reading, but had to miss a lot of school to take care of Emma when Sarah was too sick. Emma was 5, starting kindergarten in the fall, loved drawing and animals and had never been to a zoo because there was never money for things like that. Sarah had grown up in foster care, aged out at 18, had Jacob at 19 with a boyfriend who disappeared the moment things got hard. She'd worked every job she could find, always barely scraping by, always one emergency away from disaster. Thomas found himself telling them about his own childhood, something he never talked about. Growing up in a trailer park in Detroit, his mom working 3 jobs, his dad nowhere in the picture, being that kid who showed up to school hungry, wearing clothes from donation boxes, pretending he wasn't embarrassed when other kids made fun of where he lived, how a teacher named Mr. Rodriguez had noticed, had started bringing extra lunch, had tutored him after school, had believed in him when no one else did. how he'd gotten a scholarship to community college, then transferred to a university, then built his first company from nothing. "So you understand what this is like," Sarah said softly. "You've been where we are." Thomas nodded, realizing with uncomfortable clarity that he'd spent 20 years trying to forget where he came from, trying to build a wall between his past and his present so high that he couldn't see over it anymore. But sitting here in this tiny apartment that smelled like poverty and pride, he couldn't pretend anymore. These kids were him. Sarah was his mom. This was the life he'd escaped from and then spent 2 decades pretending never existed. When he finally left, promising to check in tomorrow, Jacob walked him to the door. "Mr. Bennett, sir?" the boy said quietly. "Yeah, Jacob," Thomas replied. "You're like a superhero or something. Thank you for saving us," the boy said, and Thomas felt his throat get tight. He wasn't a superhero. He was just a rich guy who'd finally remembered what it felt like to be hungry, to be scared, to be one disaster away from losing everything. He drove home to his downtown condo with its marble floors and city views, and for the first time in years, it felt empty. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay in his king-sized bed in his climate-controlled bedroom, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Jacob and Emma sleeping in a run-down apartment with second-hand furniture, and a mother who was too sick to work. He thought about the eviction notice, about how close they'd been to ending up on the street. He thought about all the other families in situations just like that, invisible people that guys like him walked past every single day without really seeing them. At 2 a.m, he got up and did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He opened the locked drawer in his office where he kept the old photo album from his childhood. There he was at 8 years old, the same age as Jacob, wearing a shirt that was too small and shoes with holes in them, standing in front of the trailer that had been his home. There was his mom, young and tired, working herself to death to keep him fed. There was Mr. Rodriguez, the teacher who'd changed everything by simply caring enough to help. Thomas had become successful, had made more money than he'd ever dreamed of, but somewhere along the way he'd forgotten the lessons that poverty had taught him. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be desperate, to be invisible, to need help, and be too proud to ask for it. The next morning, Thomas did something unprecedented. He canceled all his meetings for the entire week. His assistant, Patricia, actually gasped when he told her, "All of them, sir? Even the Donovan presentation?" she asked, incredulous. "All of them. Reschedule everything," Thomas said firmly. "I need some personal time." Patricia had worked for him for 6 years and he'd never once taken personal time, had never missed a meeting, had never prioritized anything over business. She sounded concerned when she asked if everything was okay. "Everything's fine, Patricia. Actually, everything's better than fine. Just clear my schedule and I'll explain later." Thomas hung up before she could ask more questions. He spent the morning shopping, something else he never did personally. He went to a department store and bought clothes for Jacob and Emma. Real good clothes in the right sizes. He went to a pharmacy and bought a month's worth of the medicine Sarah needed, plus vitamins and over-the-counter supplies. He went to a grocery store and filled a cart with real food, the kind that would last. Not just quick meals, but ingredients to make proper dinners. When he showed up at apartment 3C that afternoon with bags and boxes, Sarah opened the door looking shocked. "Mr. Bennett, what are you doing here? You've already done so much," she protested, but Thomas just smiled and kept carrying things in. Jacob and Emma helped unpack, their eyes getting bigger with each item. New clothes for school, medicine for their mom, food that filled the bare cabinets and empty refrigerator. "This is crazy. You can't just keep doing this," Sarah said, but her voice was weak because she was already coughing less, already looked a little less exhausted now that the stress of eviction was lifted. "Actually, I have a proposition for you," Thomas said once everything was unpacked. "I need help, and I think you might be the person to provide it." Sarah looked skeptical. "What kind of help could I possibly give you, Mr. Bennett? I'm broke, sick, and uneducated." But Thomas shook his head. "You're resourceful, you're strong, and you care about people. That's worth more than any degree." He explained his idea. His cleaning lady had quit 2 weeks ago. His condo was a mess and he was tired of living in chaos. If Sarah would be willing to clean his place a few times a week, he'd pay her $50 an hour, way more than market rate. But he didn't care about market rates anymore. Sarah stared at Thomas like he'd lost his mind. $50 an hour to clean? Mr. Bennett, that's insane. Cleaning services charge like $25 an hour, maybe $30 for the fancy ones. she said, crossing her arms. Well, I'm offering 50. Take it or leave it, Thomas replied, trying to sound casual even though this was the most important negotiation of his life for reasons he was only beginning to understand. Why are you really doing this? Sarah asked, cutting through the pretense with the directness of someone who'd been lied to enough times to recognize the truth. Thomas sat down on the worn couch and decided to be honest. Because I forgot where I came from. Because I've spent 20 years making money and 0 years making a difference. Because your son reminded me of me and I want to help. And yeah, maybe I also actually do need someone to clean my condo, and I'd rather pay someone I know needs the money than some random service. Sarah studied him for a long moment, then finally nodded. Okay, but I'm working for it. This isn't charity. I'm providing a service and earning a wage. We clear on that? She stuck out her hand and Thomas shook it, feeling like he'd just made the most important business deal of his entire career. Sarah started working the following week. Once she'd been on the antibiotics long enough to have some energy back. Thomas's condo was indeed a disaster. Takeout containers everywhere. Papers scattered across every surface. A refrigerator full of expired food and not much else. Sarah attacked it with the same fierce pride she brought to everything else, organizing his chaos into something livable. But more than that, she started making the place feel like a home. She bought a plant for the windowsill. She arranged his books in a way that made sense. She left post-it notes reminding him to eat real food and not just protein bars. Jacob and Emma came with her sometimes when school was out, and Thomas found himself looking forward to those days. He'd get home from work and find Jacob reading in his office, Emma coloring at the kitchen table, Sarah preparing a real dinner because apparently feeding him was now part of her unofficial job description. You're too skinny, Mr. Bennett. When's the last time you ate a vegetable? She'd scold. And he'd eat the healthy meal she made because it felt good to have someone care whether he lived or died. Over the next few months, something shifted. Thomas started leaving work earlier to get home before Sarah left. He started asking Jacob about school, helping with homework, teaching the kid things about science and business that made Jacob's eyes light up with excitement. He started playing games with Emma, teaching her chess, reading her stories before Sarah took them home. He started having dinner with them. Real family dinners around his expensive dining table that had never been used for its actual purpose until now. And slowly, without quite realizing it was happening, they became his family. 6 months into their arrangement, Thomas's life had changed in ways he never could have predicted. His business partners noticed the difference, commented that he seemed happier, more relaxed, more human somehow. His assistant, Patricia, figured out what was going on when she heard him on the phone saying goodnight to Jacob and Emma. And she actually smiled. It's about time, sir, she said. About time for what? Thomas asked, confused. About time you started living instead of just working, she replied, and Thomas realized she was right. But there was something he hadn't told anyone, a truth he'd been avoiding for months now, a truth that made everything more complicated and more simple at the same time. He'd fallen in love with Sarah, not the dramatic sweep you off your feet kind of love from movies, the real kind. The kind that sneaks up on you while someone's folding your laundry and making sure you eat vegetables and leaving post-it notes that make you laugh. The kind that grows from respect and admiration and shared meals and quiet moments. The kind that scares you because it's real and it matters, and you could actually lose it. He didn't say anything, didn't want to make things awkward or risk losing what they had, but he caught himself watching her more, noticing details. The way she hummed while she cooked, the way she laughed at Jacob's jokes, the way she tucked Emma's hair behind her ear, the way she looked out his windows at the city lights, and he wanted to give her everything. The whole city, the whole world, everything he had was meaningless if she wasn't there to share it. But Sarah had walls up, thick ones built from years of being let down by men who made promises they didn't keep. Then one evening everything came to a head. Sarah was cooking dinner, the kids were doing homework, and Thomas came home early with news. He'd made a decision about something big, something that would change everything, and he needed to tell them. Family meeting, he called out, using the term they'd all started using without really acknowledging it. They gathered at the dining table, Jacob and Emma looking curious, Sarah looking concerned. What's wrong, Mr. Bennett? Sarah asked, and he realized with a start that she still called him Mr. Bennett after 6 months of practically living in his home. Nothing's wrong. Actually, I have news and a question, Thomas said, suddenly nervous in a way he never got before board meetings or investor pitches. I've decided to sell 2 of my companies. Keep just one, the one I actually care about, and cut my work schedule in half. Jacob's eyes went wide. But sir, you love your work, the boy said. I used to think I did. Turns out I love being here with you guys more. Thomas replied, looking at each of them. But that brings me to my question, and it's a big one. Sarah, kids, I know this is fast and maybe crazy, but I need to ask. Thomas took a deep breath, aware that the next words out of his mouth could either give him the family he'd been dreaming of, or destroy the fragile bond they'd built over the past 6 months. I want you to move in here, permanently. Not as my employee, Sarah, as my family. All 3 of you. The words hung in the air like smoke, and nobody moved for what felt like an eternity. Emma broke the silence first. Does that mean we'd live in this big house forever? And I could have my own room with the princess wallpaper I saw at the store? She asked with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a 5-year-old who hadn't learned yet to question good things. Jacob was more cautious, looking from Thomas to his mother with worry in his green eyes. But Mom works for Mr. Bennett. How would that work if we lived here? He asked, his 8-year-old brain trying to puzzle through the logistics. Sarah hadn't said anything yet, just stared at Thomas with an expression he couldn't quite read. Was it anger? Fear? Hope? He pressed on, needing to explain before she shot him down. Sarah, I'm not asking you to be my housekeeper anymore. I'm asking you to be part of my life. You and the kids have made this cold, empty condo into a home. You've made me remember what matters. I don't want to go back to how things were before. What exactly are you asking? Sarah finally spoke, her voice careful and controlled. Because if you're asking what I think you're asking, I need you to be very clear right now, Thomas Bennett. It was the first time she'd called him Thomas instead of Mr. Bennett, and somehow that felt significant. I'm asking if you'll let me be a father to Jacob and Emma. I'm asking if you'll let me take care of all of you, not because you need charity, but because I need you. I'm asking if maybe, someday when you're ready, you might consider giving me a chance to be more than just your employer or your friend. Sarah stood up from the table abruptly, and Thomas felt his heart sink. This was it. She was going to tell him he'd crossed a line, that he'd ruined everything. But instead of walking out, she walked over to the window that looked out over Chicago, the city lights twinkling in the darkness. I was in foster care until I was 18, she said quietly. Did I tell you that already? I never knew my real parents. I bounced around from home to home, never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe. Then I met Jacob's father, and I thought maybe, finally, I'd found a home. But he left the second things got hard. Then Emma's father, same story. I've been on my own for so long that I forgot what it feels like to have someone actually want to stay. I want to stay, Sarah, Thomas said, moving to stand beside her at the window. I want to be here for school pickups and soccer games and homework help and everything else. I want Jacob to stop calling me sir and start calling me something else. I want Emma to paint that princess wallpaper all over her room. I want you to stop looking over your shoulder waiting for me to disappear. Sarah turned to face him, and he could see tears in her eyes. What if you change your mind? What if 6 months from now you decide this was all a mistake and we're back to where we started? My kids have already lost too many father figures. Then let's make it official, Thomas said, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. Let me adopt Jacob and Emma legally. Let me put their names on everything I own. Let me prove to you that I'm not going anywhere. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. You can't be serious. You've known us for 6 months. You can't just adopt someone's children. She protested, but Thomas could hear the hope creeping into her voice despite her words. Why not? I've made million-dollar decisions in less time than that. Besides, they're already my kids in every way that matters. Let's just make it legal. Jacob had been listening from the table, and suddenly he was there between them, looking up at Thomas with those green eyes that reminded him so much of his own younger self. You really want to be our dad? Like for real? The boy asked, his voice small and uncertain. More than anything, buddy, Thomas said, kneeling down so they were eye level. I know I'm not your biological father, and I can't replace whoever that guy was, but I promise you I will show up every single day. I will be at every school event, every baseball game, every science fair. I will help with homework and teach you to drive someday and embarrass you in front of your friends because that's what dads do. Emma ran over and threw her arms around Thomas's neck. I want you to be our daddy. Please say yes, Mommy, she begged Sarah, and Thomas saw the exact moment when Sarah's walls finally came down, the exact moment when she decided to take a chance, to risk her heart one more time. to believe that maybe this time it would be different. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, we'll move in, we'll try this, but Thomas, if you break my children's hearts, if you break my heart, I will never forgive you." Her voice was fierce, protective, and Thomas loved her even more for it. "I won't break your hearts, I promise," Thomas said, standing up with Emma still clinging to him. "But I need you to promise me something too, Sarah." She looked at him questioningly. "Promise me you'll give us a real chance. Not as your employer, not as some rich guy helping you out, but as a family. Promise me you'll stop waiting for me to leave." Sarah nodded slowly, and Thomas saw something shift in her expression, saw the fear start to fade and something else take its place. Trust. Real, terrifying, beautiful trust. The next few weeks were chaos in the best possible way. They moved Sarah, Jacob, and Emma's belongings into the condo, which wasn't much but was filled with memories and love. Thomas converted one of his spare bedrooms into a princess palace for Emma, complete with that wallpaper she'd been dreaming about. He turned another room into a study space for Jacob, filled with books and science equipment and everything a curious kid could want. Sarah got her own room, her own space, her independence maintained even as they became a family unit. But the best part, the part that made Thomas's chest feel tight in the best way, was the small moments. Making breakfast together on Saturday mornings, Emma climbing into his lap to watch cartoons, Jacob asking him for help with math homework, and actually calling him Dad for the first time, casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Sarah laughing at his terrible jokes and eventually, slowly, letting him hold her hand while they watched the kids play in the park. The adoption process was more complicated than Thomas expected, requiring background checks and home studies and interviews with social workers who wanted to make sure this wasn't some weird rich guy fantasy that would end badly for the kids. But Thomas welcomed the scrutiny, wanted them to dig deep, wanted everyone to understand that this was real and permanent. His lawyers handled the paperwork, but Thomas insisted on being present for every meeting, every interview, every step of the process. He wanted Sarah and the kids to see that he was all in. During one of the home visits, the social worker, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd been doing this job for 15 years, pulled Thomas aside. "Mr. Bennett, I have to ask. I've seen a lot of unusual situations in my career, but this is unique. Why are you really doing this?" she asked, her tone professional but curious. Thomas had gotten used to this question by now, had practiced his answer, but with Patricia, he decided to give the complete truth. "Because 6 months ago, I was successful, but miserable. I had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. Then a hungry kid asked me for a sandwich and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to be human." Patricia nodded thoughtfully. "And Sarah? What's the nature of your relationship with her?" This was the tricky part, the part that could derail everything if he said the wrong thing. "I love her," Thomas admitted, "but she's not ready for that yet, and I'm willing to wait. Right now we're a family figuring things out and that's enough. More than enough." Patricia studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "You know what, Mr. Bennett? I believe you. I think you're one of the rare ones who actually means what he says. I'm going to recommend approval for the adoption." The day the adoption was finalized, 6 months after Thomas first met Jacob outside that deli, they had a small celebration at the condo. Just the 4 of them, a cake that Sarah made, and 2 official documents that said Jacob Miller Bennett and Emma Miller Bennett were legally his children. Thomas held those papers like they were made of gold, more valuable than any contract or deed or stock certificate he'd ever signed. "How does it feel to officially be a dad?" Sarah asked, watching him stare at the adoption certificates with tears in his eyes. Like everything before, this was just practice for the real thing. Thomas replied honestly. Jacob came over and hugged him. No longer the skinny, scared kid from 6 months ago, but a healthy, confident 8-year-old who smiled easily and talked about his dreams of becoming a scientist. Emma showed him the drawing she'd made of their family, 4 stick figures holding hands in front of a big house with a rainbow overhead. "That's us," she announced proudly. "That's our family." And Thomas realized with overwhelming clarity that this little girl had given him something he'd spent 47 years looking for without knowing it, a place to belong. That night, after the kids were in bed, Thomas and Sarah sat on the balcony overlooking the city. It had become their routine, this quiet time after the chaos of bedtime stories and teeth brushing and goodnight hugs. "Thank you," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "For what?" Thomas asked, genuinely confused. "For not giving up on us, for seeing past the poverty and the mess and the complications. for giving my children a father who actually wants them. She was crying now, quiet tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. Sarah, look at me, Thomas said gently, turning to face her. You saved me just as much as I saved you. Probably more. I was drowning in success and didn't even know it. You and the kids threw me a lifeline. He reached over and took her hand, the first real romantic gesture he'd made since they moved in. She didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand back and smiled. So what happens now? She asked him. Now we figure out the rest as we go. Thomas replied, meaning it. There's no script for this, no business plan. We just wake up every day and choose to be a family. 3 months after the adoption was finalized, Thomas took the family on their first real vacation. Not somewhere fancy or expensive, but to a cabin by a lake in Wisconsin where they could fish and swim and just be together without the distractions of the city. It was Jacob who'd asked about camping after reading about it in a book, and Thomas realized with a jolt that these kids had never been on a vacation, had never left Chicago, had never experienced the simple joy of roasting marshmallows over a fire and sleeping under stars. The cabin was modest but comfortable, and watching Jacob catch his first fish, seeing Emma squeal with delight as she found frogs by the shore, sharing quiet mornings with Sarah on the porch while the kids still slept, Thomas understood what wealth actually meant. It had nothing to do with the numbers in his bank account and everything to do with moments like these, collected like treasures and stored in his heart. I used to think I had everything figured out, he told Sarah one night after the kids were asleep. I had this whole life plan. Make money, build companies, retire young, maybe travel the world. And now? Sarah asked, leaning her head against his shoulder in a gesture that still felt new enough to make his heart skip. Now I realize I was planning for the wrong life. None of that mattered. None of it made me happy. This, right here, this is what I was actually looking for all along. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised him. I've been thinking about going back to school, getting my GED, maybe taking some community college classes. The kids are settled now, and you've given us stability. Maybe it's time I invested in myself a little. Thomas felt pride swell in his chest. That's an amazing idea. What would you want to study? He asked, genuinely curious. Sarah laughed, a little embarrassed. I always thought about being a teacher, working with kids like Jacob and Emma who come from rough situations. But that seems like a big dream for someone like me. Thomas turned to face her, serious now. Someone like you? Sarah, you're one of the strongest, most capable people I've ever met. If you want to be a teacher, you'll be an incredible teacher. I'll support you however you need. The vacation ended too soon, but they returned to Chicago, changed somehow, more solid as a unit. Thomas had fully stepped back from 2 of his companies, keeping only the tech startup he'd founded himself, the one that actually excited him. He worked from home 3 days a week now, was present for school pickups, helped with homework, coached Emma's soccer team even though he knew nothing about soccer. His old colleagues thought he'd lost his mind, walking away from millions in potential earnings. But Thomas had never been richer. 1 year after meeting Jacob outside Henderson's Deli, Thomas planned a surprise. He'd been working on something in secret, something that would show Sarah and the kids just how permanent this was, just how much they'd changed his life. He'd bought a house. Not a mansion or some ridiculous display of wealth, but a real home in a good neighborhood with a yard big enough for a swing set and a dog. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a kitchen where Sarah could cook her amazing meals, a basement where Jacob could set up his science experiments, and a room that could be Emma's art studio. The day he took them to see it, he'd told them they were going to visit a friend. When they pulled up in front of the house with the sold sign in the yard, Sarah looked confused. Thomas, whose house is this? She asked. Ours, he replied, pulling out the keys. I bought it for us, for our family. The condo is great, but we need space to grow. We need a yard for the dog we're going to get. We need a real home. Sarah stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. You bought a house, without telling me. Thomas felt a moment of panic. Had he overstepped? Was she angry? I wanted it to be a surprise. Do you hate it? We don't have to take it. I can sell it and we can find something together, he said quickly. But Sarah wasn't angry. She was crying again, those overwhelmed tears he'd learned to recognize over the past year. Show me inside, she whispered. The house was empty except for a few pieces of furniture in the living room where Thomas had set up a surprise. Photos of them as a family over the past year, professionally framed and arranged on the walls. Pictures from Emma's kindergarten graduation, Jacob's science fair where he won second place, their vacation at the cabin, random moments of daily life that Thomas had been secretly documenting. "This is us," Emma breathed, running from picture to picture. "This is our family." Jacob was quieter, studying each photo carefully, but Thomas saw him wipe his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Sarah walked through the empty house, seeing potential in every room. "The kitchen is huge," she noted. "I was thinking you could take cooking classes if you wanted. You're amazing, but if it's something you're interested in, we could turn it into more than just feeding us," Thomas said, following her. "You've thought of everything," Sarah said, turning to face him in the middle of the empty living room. "Not everything. I haven't figured out the most important part yet," Thomas admitted. Sarah looked at him questioningly, and Thomas realized this was the moment. Now or never. He got down on one knee right there in the empty house in front of their kids and their photos and their future. "Sarah Miller, you've made me the happiest man alive. You've given me a family, a purpose, a reason to be better than I was. I know we did things backwards, becoming a family before becoming a couple, but I love you. I've loved you for months and I can't keep pretending I don't. Will you marry me?" Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Jacob and Emma were bouncing with excitement. "Say yes, Mom," Emma shouted. "We want Mr. Thomas to really be our dad forever." Sarah laughed through her tears. "He already is your dad forever, baby. The adoption papers say so," she said, then looked back at Thomas. "But yes, I'll marry you, Thomas Bennett. I love you too. I have for a while now. I was just scared to say it." Thomas stood up and kissed her, their first real kiss, and it felt like coming home. The wedding was small and perfect, held in the backyard of their new house 3 months later. Just close friends, a few colleagues, and Jacob and Emma standing up front as best man and maid of honor. Thomas had offered to plan something huge and expensive, but Sarah had insisted she wanted something simple and meaningful. "I don't need a fairy tale wedding," she'd said. "I already got my fairy tale. I just need the people I love." So they'd kept it intimate, meaningful, real. As Thomas stood at the makeshift altar watching Sarah walk toward him in a simple white dress, with Jacob walking her down the aisle because that's what she'd wanted, he thought about the path that had led them here. One moment of paying attention, one decision to help a hungry kid, one choice to see past his own comfortable life and actually care about someone else's struggle. That's all it had taken to completely transform everything. His old life, the one of endless work and empty success, felt like it had belonged to someone else entirely. "Do you, Thomas Bennett, take Sarah Miller to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the officiant asked. "I do," Thomas said clearly, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "And do you, Sarah Miller, take Thomas Bennett to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Sarah smiled, that beautiful smile that still made his heart skip. "I do." When they kissed, Emma cheered so loud that everyone laughed, and Jacob wiped his eyes again, and Thomas thought this was what life was supposed to feel like. Not the hollow victories of closed deals and rising stock prices, but this: love and laughter and family. The reception was casual, a barbecue in their backyard with music and dancing, and Emma insisting that Thomas dance with her first before his new wife. "I want to dance with my daddy," she announced, and Thomas swept her up in his arms, spinning her around while she giggled. Jacob cut in halfway through, and then Sarah, and then all 4 of them were dancing together in the middle of the yard while their guests cheered. "This is perfect," Sarah whispered in his ear. "This is everything." That night, after the guests left and the kids were finally asleep, exhausted from excitement, Thomas and Sarah sat on the porch of their new home. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly, "for taking a chance on me, for letting me be part of this incredible family, for saving my life." Sarah laughed softly. "You've got that backwards. You saved us." But Thomas shook his head. "No, you don't understand. I was dying inside, slowly suffocating under the weight of a life that looked successful but felt empty. You and the kids, you gave me air. You gave me a reason to live instead of just exist." "Well then," Sarah said, taking his hand, "I guess we saved each other." And that was exactly right. They'd saved each other in all the ways that mattered. 2 years later, Thomas sold his last company for an amount of money that was almost obscene. But instead of keeping it, or buying more things he didn't need, he did something different. He started a foundation, one that helped single mothers like Sarah had been. one that paid rent for families facing eviction, one that bought medicine for people who couldn't afford it, one that fed hungry kids who reminded him of Jacob. The foundation grew quickly, helping hundreds of families in its first year alone. Thomas had finally figured out what to do with his wealth, how to use it in a way that actually mattered. And the best part was involving his kids in the work. Jacob, now 10 years old, helped design a mentorship program connecting successful professionals with kids from low-income families. Emma, now 7, insisted they include art supplies in every family care package because everyone needs colors to be happy. Sarah got her GED, then her teaching certificate, and started working at an elementary school in the neighborhood where they used to live, becoming exactly the kind of teacher she'd always dreamed of being. Thomas watched his family flourish and grow, and every single day he thought about that moment outside Henderson's deli. What if he'd walked past Jacob like he'd walked past 100 other people in need? What if he'd been too busy, too focused on his meeting, too wrapped up in his own world to stop? He would have missed everything. He would have missed the greatest adventure of his life. People asked him sometimes in interviews about the foundation or articles about his transformation from ruthless businessman to philanthropist, what made him change, and he always told them the truth. A hungry boy asked me for a sandwich, and I actually listened. That's all it took. One moment of paying attention instead of walking past. One moment of seeing another person's humanity instead of treating them as invisible. One moment of caring enough to help, Thomas would say. And that one moment gave me everything I'd been looking for without knowing it. A family, a purpose, a reason to be better than I was. The foundation threw a gala every year to raise money and awareness, and Thomas always insisted that Jacob and Emma speak at it, sharing their story in their own words. At the third annual gala, Jacob, now 11 and remarkably articulate, stood at the podium in front of 300 wealthy donors. 3 years ago, I was standing outside a deli, hungry and scared, asking strangers for help. Most people walked past like I was invisible, but Mr. Thomas stopped. He saw me. He listened. He helped. And that changed everything. Jacob paused, looking out at the crowd. But here's what I want you to understand. My dad didn't save us because he's special or different or because he's rich. He saved us because he decided to pay attention, because he chose to care. And every single person in this room can do that. The speech brought the house down, and the foundation raised $2 million that night, money that would help hundreds more families. But the best moment came after, when they were driving home and Emma said sleepily from the back seat, "Daddy, do you think there are other kids like we were? Kids who just need someone to see them?" Thomas looked at her in the rearview mirror. "Yeah, baby girl. There are a lot of kids like you were." Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, "Then we have to help them, all of them." And that became the family mission, the thing that drove them forward together. Sarah taught during the day and volunteered at the foundation in the evenings. Jacob started a coding club at school and donated all the proceeds to buy computers for kids who didn't have them. Emma sold her artwork and used the money to buy art supplies for children in shelters. And Thomas, well, Thomas had finally figured out what success actually meant. It wasn't about how much money you made or how many companies you built. It was about how many lives you touched, how many people you helped, how much love you shared. 5 years after that fateful day outside Henderson's deli, Thomas Bennett stood in the kitchen of their home making pancakes while Sarah packed lunches for school. Jacob, now 13, was helping Emma, now 10, with her math homework at the kitchen table. The dog they'd adopted, a golden retriever named Buddy, was begging for scraps. The radio was playing something cheerful, and Thomas felt a contentment so profound it sometimes made him want to cry. This was it. This was the life he'd been searching for without knowing it. Not the mansions or the cars or the bank accounts, though those things had their uses when directed toward good. But this, the mundane magic of an ordinary Tuesday morning, the sound of his daughter laughing at his son's terrible jokes, the smell of coffee brewing, the feeling of Sarah's hand on his shoulder as she passed behind him, the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Dad, are you crying into the pancakes again?" Jacob asked, looking up from Emma's math homework with a grin. "Maybe a little," Thomas admitted, laughing and wiping his eyes. "They're tears of happiness, buddy." Emma bounced over and hugged his waist. "You're so weird, Dad, but we love you anyway," she said, and Thomas hugged her back, careful not to get pancake batter on her school uniform. "I love you too, Princess." I love all of you more than you'll ever know. Later that morning, after dropping the kids at school, Thomas stopped by Henderson's Deli for coffee. Stan was still there, still serving his regulars, still raising his eyebrows at the world. "Morning, Thomas." "The usual?" Stan asked, already reaching for a cup. "Actually, Stan, make it 5 coffees, and 5 of those breakfast sandwiches," Thomas said, pulling out his wallet. "5? You feeding an army?" Stan joked. "Something like that," Thomas replied with a smile. He took the food and coffee and walked around the neighborhood, looking for people who needed it. A homeless veteran sitting by the subway entrance. A tired-looking woman waiting at the bus stop with 2 young children. A teenager who looked like he hadn't eaten in days. He handed out the food and coffee, sometimes with conversation, sometimes just with a smile and a nod. Most people were surprised. Some were suspicious, but all of them were grateful. And Thomas understood now that this was his purpose. Not the grand gestures or the $1,000,000 donations, though those mattered too, but the small acts of seeing people, of acknowledging their humanity, of helping in whatever way he could. Because here's the truth that Thomas learned from a hungry boy outside a deli 5 years ago. Every single person you pass on the street has a story. Every person struggling, every person asking for help, every person you might be tempted to ignore because you're too busy or too important or too focused on your own problems. They're all human beings deserving of dignity and compassion. And you never know how one small act of kindness might change everything, not just for them, but for you too. Thomas's life had been transformed not because he had money to give, though that helped, but because he decided to stop and listen. Because he chose to see Jacob as a person instead of a problem. Because he opened his heart when it would have been easier to keep it closed. And that decision, that one moment of choosing compassion over convenience, had given him everything he'd ever wanted and never knew he needed. So let me ask you something, and I really want you to think about this. When was the last time you stopped to help someone who needed it? When was the last time you saw someone struggling and actually did something about it instead of walking past? I'm not talking about huge gestures or life-changing interventions. Just small acts of human kindness, buying someone a meal, listening to someone's story, acknowledging someone's existence, because you never know. That moment might change their life, but more importantly, it might change yours. Tell me in the comments about a time someone helped you when you needed it, or a time you helped someone else. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story today. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, hit that subscribe button because we share stories like this all the time. Stories about real people, real struggles, and real hope. Thomas Bennett learned that true wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in love, in family, in the difference you make in other people's lives. And that's a lesson all of us could stand to remember. Thanks for watching. And remember, the next person who asks you for help might just be offering you the greatest gift you'll ever receive. Don't walk past. Stop. Listen. Care. It might just change everything.